Welcome to BIV Today, the daily podcast from the newsroom of Business in Vancouver. I'm Kirk LaPointe, publisher and editor-in-chief. This is a week dubbed National Volunteer Week, recognizing the millions of Canadians who provide support to the hundreds of thousands of operations that wouldn't really exist without their benevolence and commitment. But the recognition of volunteerism and the participation in it is something Canada has a challenge with on some levels. And I'm pleased today to have the CEO and president of Volunteer Canada here for a conversation, and also in part to talk about how those in business can be most supportive. Megan Conway is a fellow in the School of Public Policy and Administration at Carleton University and former chair of health and community studies at Algonquin College near Ottawa. She joins me from Ottawa today. Good to see you.
Thank you, Kirk, for the kind introduction.
Well, help me with the numbers here. How many people would you say are volunteering in this country?
Well, you know what? We are a nation of people who give back, Kirk, and I think we know that in lots of different ways, and we saw that especially during the pandemic. I will point to some data that was collected by the Government of Canada through their giving and volunteering and participation survey from 2018, which says that 5 out of 6 Canadians participate in either formal volunteering or informally in a variety of different ways. So that equates to like 24 million Canadians, Kirk, who are giving of their time and their energy and their knowledge to a whole bunch of different causes across the country.
Yeah, that's a pretty large number. When we look at this and what it does in terms of filling a gap in the economy, that's appreciable amounts of money and resourcing of any sort. Do we do a reasonable job, do you think, in this country of recognizing that?
I think that there's a much further way we could go as a nation to recognizing the economic, social, environmental, and collective contribution that volunteers are making. We know from recent data that volunteers contribute approximately $8 billion dollars to the economy annually, which is a tremendous amount of value that they're offering. So I would say that volunteers do more than just offer help or offer service. They're also often taking on important tasks in charitable organizations. They're performing unpaid labor in a variety of different ways that, the economy, I think, needs to recognize, and businesses are increasingly recognizing, Kirk. I would say, Volunteer Canada hosts a corporate community engagement council that is leading businesses across Canada, and national and international businesses participate in. And I think businesses are increasingly seeing the importance of supporting their employees to volunteer.
Yeah, I think you've touched on the one area where I think there is the opportunity there, because I would also think, and I can speak as a volunteer, you wouldn't want formal economic reward for this. I mean,
no, definitely not.
Yeah,
definitely not. Yeah. I think we want to steer clear of remuneration, formal remuneration for volunteering. I think increasingly we might be seeing different approaches to address some of the barriers that exist for volunteering. Many municipalities or jurisdictions across the country are saying, wait a second, we're asking people to volunteer. We're going to cover the cost of their police record check, for instance. And there are often hidden costs, I would say, associated with volunteering that I think we need to do a better job of recognizing. But I definitely wouldn't encourage payment for volunteering. I think it's counterproductive to the kinds of ways we want to engender participating.
Yeah. Sure. The pandemic disrupted absolutely everything, including the ability to volunteer, for that matter, because an awful lot of these operations require a physical presence at times. As you look back now in the last couple of years, was there any kind of new form of reflection that the country had, do you think, about the importance of participating in areas that, say, have an adjacency to healthcare, an adjacency to some of the issues involving mental health, an adjacency to even things like social justice, where the volunteerism is of importance, and where Canadians began to recognize that a bit differently?
I think that's a really great question, Kirk. I hear anecdotal stories, for instance, from my colleagues across the country, one of whom leads the network of volunteer centers across Quebec, where the Quebec government leaned heavily on the Federation of Volunteer Centres in Quebec to utilize them as a supply chain to support the delivery of vaccines across the province. And I mean, I think we've all experienced within the last year what a tremendous voluntary effort it took to mount the vaccination clinic for COVID-19. And I don't think that would have been able to have been accomplished without the tremendous efforts of volunteers from coast to coast to coast. I think about Vaccine Hunters. They're a tremendous group, a voluntary group that started, through social media to support enabling people's access to vaccines. I think the other thing I would say, Kirk, throughout the pandemic, and I don't know if this was your experience, but it was certainly mine, but the pandemic had a way of isolating us. I think of, in some ways, disconnecting us. And I think we're seeing increasing levels of polarization in our communities because of some of that disconnection and isolation.
Yeah.
I think the ability to come back and contribute in different ways is, I think, an opportunity for us to think about what a broader recovery will look like from the pandemic, and will help us with some of those subtle mental health challenges that we may have all faced throughout the pandemic of being more isolated and more disconnected.
Yeah, you have a theme this year, which is volunteering is empathy in action, but you speak also of the polarization, and I would support that. I think I'd see it, and it's certainly recognized in the research that's taking place, is that we've had a polarization. You know, even the whole vaccination process, the participation in restrictions during the pandemic was often very polarizing in communities, among families, and all of that. Is empathy something that we, as a country, through our volunteers, we have to work on a lot more?
I think empathy practicing empathy through acts of service allows us to reconnect with ourselves and with our colleagues and with our neighbors in profound ways. I think for myself, it gets me out of my individual box or my own mindset or my own sometimes limited thinking around the right way for things to happen in the world, Kirk. And I think seeing the experience that one another is having, or someone else is having, and being able to connect with that individual, not in a sympathetic way, not in a condescending way, but in a way that is built on empathy and on compassion, I think moves us forward and moves us together in ways that are important now as we come out of the pandemic and out of some of this time of polarization.
What barriers do you still notice to participation in volunteering, as regards to things like social justice, equity, inclusion? What do you still notice out there, Megan?
You know, that's a really great question, and I can answer that only from my perspective of privilege, which is, you know, I'm a white woman leading a national charitable organization, so I really often have to turn to my colleagues who are Black, Indigenous, or people of color from across the country to learn from them and hear about how they conceptualize, understand, and talk about volunteering. So I think one of the challenges we face is that we may not all use the same words or the language of volunteering. Colleagues in the Black community may refer to it as mentorship, for instance, or think about how they mentor one another as a form of giving back. And I understand that many Indigenous languages do not have a word for volunteering, and yet we know Indigenous communities and people in Indigenous communities give back in a tremendous way. And so I think we have to think about some of the nuanced approaches to participation that are rooted in equity and justice, for sure. I also think that the financial barriers that I touched on earlier are ones that we have to be mindful of, and I would encourage municipalities in particular and provincial governments to look at how they might play a role in addressing some of those financial burdens that exist for volunteers who have a desire to give back. Requiring a volunteer to have a car to drive, for instance, or to pay the cost of a voluntary record check. Those practices might need to be looked at in different ways, Kirk, as we move forward. So I think there are lots of barriers that still exist, and I think we need to think about recentering new narratives around volunteerism and participation as we move forward that are centered on the voices of those who are coming from diverse equity-seeking groups.
Thanks. We've certainly seen a kind of a new relationship that people have in many cases, particularly in the so-called knowledge economy, the white-collar part of the economy, with the relationship to work and the presence in person the amount of remote work that we're doing, the hybrid approach that's being done. So I wonder whether there is also a reconsideration by business that's necessary now in this new environment to think through how it is that they can encourage their workforces to still stay committed and active in participating in volunteerism in the community.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I guess I would offer a couple of thoughts on that. One of which is that I would just say that I think there's a really important conversation that the voluntary sector alongside business needs to be having around the future of volunteerism in Canada, Kirk. I think we are spending a lot of thinking around what the future of work looks like. And I would say that we need to think as much about what the future of volunteering needs to look like in Canada. I would say that leading businesses and corporations across the country are championing corporate community engagement through their participation in a variety of different ways and through thinking about how their corporate entity might make a difference environmentally and socially through a variety of different ways. I would also say that I think those corporations and businesses that are leading the way the most are those that are able to think about how to support employee learning and employee engagement through participation and volunteerism. So increasingly, we're finding that employees want to give back, but they're limited in giving back in person. One way they may be able to do that is by actively learning about important causes in their community and by gaining knowledge about some of the issues that are really super important within their own communities, and then by finding ways individually to contribute to those causes. So finding blended programs for volunteerism for corporate audiences and for corporate employees specifically relevant as we move forward and think about what volunteering is going to look like in the coming year or 3 years, even for that matter, Kirk.
It's interesting. One of the boards I'm on, there was a board member, and I'm not betraying my board conversations, so I'm okay there. But he actually said, it bothers me a great deal that I'm needed to volunteer, that somehow this isn't looked after. Do we run the risk of taxing Canadians too much, or tasking them, I guess, more than taxing them, tasking them with some of the pressure of volunteering, given that we don't have the other kinds of support in place that are more direct, that are either coming from government or business or individuals?
Well, I think that's a challenging question to have a really straight answer on, Kirk. I think on the one hand, I would say that it's a great privilege to be able to volunteer, and that there is the contributions we provide collectively, I think, are what strengthen our nation. I think if we left all of the acts of the charitable and nonprofit sector or community organizations or clubs or service clubs to some sort of transactional relationship, we might be in a bit of trouble, Kirk. I would kind of worry about what that would look like. The other thing I'm going to highlight or flag or say, which is kind of a bit of I'm going to offer a bit of a counter perspective, only in as much as I think we're seeing across the charitable sector, across community organizations, a tremendous amount of burnout in staff and a tremendous amount of burnout across volunteers also. I think the needs are tremendous that we're experiencing. I mean, some of what we're seeing in terms of some of the climate crises that we're all living through are tremendous. And the acceleration of crises are tremendous, I think. And so how we manage ourselves through those kinds of moments collectively, I think, are important questions. What are the kinds of supports that individuals and collective organizations and groups need to really feel more buoyant and lifted up? I think we're seeing this notion of trauma as something that's an important thread we have to pay attention to, especially for those that are in constant helping roles or constantly trying to respond to need in their communities. So I do think it's important that we really think about what a robust social recovery looks like, Kirk. And I think to that end, we do need to work collectively with our partners in business and in government to think about what a national voluntary action strategy would look like for the country. I know many other jurisdictions are developing those, and I think it's a great opportunity for us as Canadians to think about, hey, what do we want what do we want volunteering to look like for the next 10 years, and what kind of supports might various sectors put in place to enable strong and vibrant and resilient volunteers who have the kind of energy and resources they need to really do the work that they want to do moving forward.
Yeah. Would it be fair to say that this is just not a conversation we've had yet as a country because we've taken somewhat for granted the fact that there will always be people stepping up to step in?
I don't think I could have said it any better myself, Kirk. I think the humility of who we are as a country and as Canadians may, it's a great thing to be humble. And on the other hand, I think there is a way in which we take for granted the impact and the contributions of the 24 million Canadians who show up in a variety of different ways. So I'm really encouraging us this National Volunteer Week to really think about what would it take for us collectively to look at broader structural supports that would recognize the contributions and impact of volunteers, for sure.
Yeah, you've actually answered the last question I was going to ask you, which is what can we do this week to think about this in a different way?
Well, one thing I would say, Kirk, just in terms of this week, is I do think it's really important to celebrate the contributions and to recognize the contributions of volunteers all across the country. So I want to just take a moment to say thank you if you're a volunteer, or if you're even thinking about volunteering. I think there's a tremendous amount of reward that individuals get from volunteering. And I don't think we do enough to recognize and celebrate the contributions of volunteers. So that's one thing. I would also say this notion of having a conversation around how we might strengthen Canada's volunteering infrastructure is something I'm really mindful of as the head of this national organization that's committed to volunteerism. So I want to encourage all of us to think about ways we can do that. And I know there's lots of activities happening in Vancouver and in Victoria and across BC that are celebrating volunteers. And so I would also encourage individuals alongside the celebration to think about what are the supports that might be put in place that will strengthen our volunteering infrastructure moving forward.
Yeah, and certainly business has a role to play in fortifying.
Absolutely. And I know there's some leading businesses on the West Coast that are taking a role in actually championing and really celebrating and leading corporate community engagement activities and thinking about really mindfully and consciously the ways that their employees can get involved in various community initiatives across the province.
Yeah, always good conversation to have around volunteering and its importance. Megan, I want to thank you so much for your time today and good luck with this week.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. It's a pleasure to meet you, Kirk. Thank you.
Megan Conway is the CEO and president of Volunteer Canada. It's National Volunteer Week in this country. I encourage everybody to give some consideration to how it is we can help each other. I'm Kirk LaPointe, publisher and editor-in-chief at BIV. Thanks a lot for watching.